Hello and welcome to another alternate media special. It's been a while since I've been here, um, but I am now back, and we are continuing our series in Irresistible. Uh, this has been painful. We're now in chapter 3. I will try and make it all the way through the chapter. But as you guys well know by this point, it's pretty bad, and so it requires a lot of commentary to explain exactly how bad it is. But we'll try and make it through a whole chapter. This chapter is called Temple Tantrum. Hang on. Before I get started, I gotta do a sip of beer. Whew. It's a pumpkin beer because this is fall and it's my favorite season, and it's my favorite season for beer. For those of you who have seen the Genesis episode, you know this already. All right, let's jump in. I need you to imagine for just a moment what would not have happened and who we would never have met if Israel had listened to Samuel and abandoned the idea of a royal family. There would have been no King Saul, no King David or King Solomon. Solomon's parents would never have met. Not only would there have been no Psalms of David, there would have been no Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, or Song of Solomon. There would have been no record of the activities of the kings, and there would be no documents documenting. Okay, so there would be no documents documenting what the prophets prophesied in response to the decisions of the kings. Why? Because there would be no kings. Okay, pretty solid so far. That's pretty true. Oh. The storyline would be much different. A lot different. But here's the real kicker. If there had been no king, there would have been no temple. All of the cool kids with kings had temples too. So Israel eventually got herself one of those. Just as Israel's kings brought with them all the problems associated with kings, the temple led to the challenges associated with temples. Israel didn't need a king, and Israel didn't need a temple. Both of these were attempts to be like all the other nations. That is a blatant and outright lie. The temple was literally always the intention. The tabernacle was a temporary measure because the children of Israel were not in Israel proper yet. It was mobile solely because they had to pick up and move camp as they wandered around the desert. The intention was always that when they came to Israel, they would build a temple on Mount Moriah. You know, I can actually prove this with Genesis. A lot of people, when speaking about the sacrificial system, they'll point to the sacrifices that were made by some of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, and say, well, see, that wasn't at a temple, or at the temple. Here's the problem, though. Almost every single one of them took place on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. So the location seems to be very important to God. Right out of the book of Genesis, the location is important. And even before the temple is built, right? When David, I believe King David goes to the threshing floor and makes an offering there. That is still Mount Moriah. Like, the location where sacrifices are made in the Bible has literally never changed since the book of Genesis. Okay? That is the mountain that God chose. Like, God chose that. That's why sacrifices have always been performed there. The only exception is the tabernacle. Like, that's actually the exception. The rule has always been Mount Moriah. So the intention has always been Mount Moriah. And the tabernacle was a temporary measure until this point. The idea that the temple brought problems is also borderline heretical. The temple was always the intention. How do we know this? Well, Moses was told to build the temple after what he was shown. Okay, Moses was shown a vision of heaven and the temple that is in heaven, and that is what the tabernacle was intended to be based on, at least as much as he could make a mobile tabernacle like that. But the temple was to be a permanent measure, while Israel had residency in the land of Israel. So yeah, this idea that there was never an intention for a temple, that the temple itself brings problems, it doesn't. I'm sure we're going to see him try and point out problems that the temple brought, and we'll address those as they come about. Sure, he's right. Kings brought about their own problems. That's true. But to try and tie the temple in with that, furthermore, to try and tie the temple in with pagan practice, and to make the statement that Israel was they were just trying to be like the pagans. So pagans have kings and temples, and so Israel wanted to have a king and a temple. No, that is, again, bordering on heresy. As again, that was literally always the intention. Anyway, he says, let me explain. This next section is called Taking Stock. After taking over from the disaster that was King Saul, King David spent years expanding, settling, and fortifying the nation of Israel. Eventually, there was a break in the action. During the lull, it dawned on David that while everybody else had moved indoors, God was still living in a tent, like a Boy Scout, like a shepherd. So it's interesting. So you see that he equated God first to a modern concept of moral uprightness, right? A Boy Scout. So God was living outside in a tent like a Boy Scout, right? First of all, but then he equates him to a shepherd, like a shepherd, right? Because he's supposed to be the good shepherd or the great shepherd or what have you. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. The problem is the assumption that shepherds always slept outside. It's interesting. They only slept outside while the sheep were out in the fields, which was only for a season. Other than that, when they brought the sheep in, they slept indoors. So it's interesting that while Israel was in the wilderness, the sheep were out in the fields, that God was outside in a tent. And it's even more interesting that once Israel was brought in and at home in their land, that God chose to come indoors, as it were, in a temple. Because let's not forget that the temple was God's design. That he's going to try and make this out like that was an idea that men came up with and God just rolled with it, which I think is ridiculous. If God doesn't intend for something, he's not going to just roll with man's idea on it. When God has a specific intention, it happens, regardless of man's desires. So, let's see. So David made an appointment with the prophet in residence, Nathan. And here's what he said. Look at this. Here I am, comfortable in a luxurious house of cedar, and the chest of God sits in a plain tent. Nathan smiled and suggested David do something about it. He went so far as to suggest that whatever David had in mind, God would support. Turns out Nathan was wrong. He spoke out of turn. What happens next is often overlooked. On the evening following Nathan's whatever suits you conversation with David, God spoke to Nathan. He explicitly tells him to go back and give David a different answer. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place, with a tent as my dwelling. This is my favorite part. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers who I command to shepherd my people, Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? God was fine living in a tent. He seemed to prefer it. Besides, he wasn't home most of the time anyway. Okay, so you see the narrative he's trying to build, and he's actually leaving out a very important detail. The reason... First of all, Nathan was a prophet of God, so when Nathan says, come up with an idea on how to build God a house, he's not speaking out of turn, okay? God didn't tell Nathan, no, you were wrong, and he didn't tell Nathan, go give David a different answer. But he did, in somewhat of a way, amend the original statement that Nathan made. The reason David was not to build the temple was because of how much blood was on his hands. This is why Solomon was chosen to build the temple. And I'm sure he's going to have comments about that. Okay, he says, but there was something else in play here. Unlike David's fine house of stone, everything about the tabernacle was temporary. It was constructed of linen curtains, goat's hair, curtains, and wood. It was in constant need of repair, but the portable and temporary nature of the tabernacle underscored the point of the tabernacle. Okay, so first of all, he's actually making a huge assumption here. Sure, he lists the materials that the tabernacle was made out of. However, the assumption he's making is that those materials decayed and were temporary. The interesting thing, particularly having to do with the festival of Sukkot especially, because it's intended to be a reminder of the desert wanderings, right, is that what is taught about the desert wanderings within Judaism is that the presence of God had a renewing effect. Okay, that their clothes did not wear out, that their tents did not wear out, because God miraculously kept these things in a renewed state. He kept them intact. So it's a large assumption to assume that the tabernacle was decaying and in need of repair. Certainly, if the Israelites themselves had the miraculous renewal effect, then the temple or the tabernacle itself would also have these things. So it's a ridiculous assumption to me. And of course, he's trying to lead up to the idea that the whole intention was that it would be temporary and not permanent, which is, again, ridiculous, because the temple that's in heaven is eternal because it's in heaven. And what is in heaven is eternal, which seems to indicate that the temple was supposed to be eternal. Anyway, But the portable and temporary nature of the tabernacle underscored the point of the tabernacle. Everything about the tabernacle and everything connected to the tabernacle were merely context for something greater and grander. The tabernacle was a means to an end, and in the end, the need for a tabernacle would end as well. Those of you who haven't seen it, Seamus and I have a video, a Killing the Church video, on YouTube about whether or not the sacrificial system and the temple system have been abolished because of Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. Because that's the assumption, and that's what he's alluding to here, is that somehow the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua effectively nullified and voided the temple system here on earth. And I don't have the time in this video to go into why that's not a correct assumption. But we have an at-length discussion about that in that video, so I would encourage you to go and watch that video either right now or after you finish this video, or just at some point if you are curious to learn more about that subject. Let's see. To put words in God's mouth, a dangerous thing to do, it was as if God was saying, I'm fine with my temporary digs. This entire system is temporary anyway. There's no point building me something fancy that I won't use for very long. So, he is right. Putting words in God's mouth is a very dangerous thing to do, and what he basically just did was heretical. You see, God numerous times in his Torah says that his Torah is eternal. So, again, the temple and the temple system being in the eternal Torah, it's another indication outside of the heavenly temple that this whole system was intended to be eternal. So trying to force God to say that it was always intended to be temporary is ridiculous. Let's see. I am not getting through this very quickly. We may not finish the chapter. From there, the conversation takes a hard right turn. After assuring David he was fine living in a tent, God changes the subject completely. Paraphrasing, God says to David, "Enough about building me a new house. Let's talk about your family, David. Enough about what's temporary. Let's talk about the end game. You want to build me a house, but I'm going to establish your house. I'm going to do something through your family that has forever written all over it." Similar to his promise to Abraham, God tells David he will make his name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. I'm guessing you'd already heard of David, too. God tells David he has too much blood on his hands to build the temple. See, here we go. He's trying to mention this as though this is a side fact, but no, this is actually the main point of, see, God doesn't actually change the subject. He says that God changes the subject and is trying to shift focus to David's family lineage. That's not what happens here. God tells David he has too much blood on his hands to build the temple. That's the whole point. Like, that is literally the whole point as to why God says David can't build the temple. He has too much blood on his hands. Not because God doesn't want the temple, not because God doesn't need the temple, which, of course, God doesn't need anything from anybody, but not because God never intended for there to be a permanent temple, because David has too much blood on his hands to build it. That's literally where it begins and ends. David doesn't argue. He doesn't give up on his idea. He forges ahead to ensure that when his son Solomon becomes king, everything will be in place for construction of a permanent structure. David envisions a temple to beat all the temples, the ultimate temple. Yes, because what else would you offer? The only God in all of existence? What else would you offer the creator of all of existence but the greatest of all temples? David raised the money. He had plans drawn. He hired stone cutters. He did everything right up to cutting the ribbon and sticking a shovel in the ground. According to plan, when Solomon took the throne, the grand construction project began. 20 years later, it was completed. At the end of those 20 years, Solomon invited God to leave his tent and move indoors, so to speak. Eventually, he did, so to speak. But before he did, he said something to Solomon that should have sent chills down his spine. It didn't, but it should have. God gave Solomon the "before I hand you the car keys" talk. Remember that? Either the one your parents had with you or the one you've had with your own kids. With my kids, it went something like this. I'm so happy I was able to purchase a car for you to drive. I hope you enjoy it, but understand, if you abuse this freedom, I'll sell it. This is not unique to Solomon. This is literally the talk that's been had with every king of Israel, pretty much. God's version to Solomon is found in 1 Kings. It goes something like this. Solomon, I really appreciate all that's gone into creating this fabulous piece of architecture. I accept your gift. I'll move in immediately. But Solomon, if I catch you or my people misbehaving out there because you think I'm tucked away safely in here, I will tear this place apart. Okay, that's a ridiculous paraphrase, because why would they assume that God is limited to the temple but not limited to the tabernacle? The tabernacle was still standing, so why wouldn't God be limited to it if logically he would be limited to the temple? It's just, it's a stupid assumption to make, to assume that that's what was going on, or that that's even what they thought. This piece of real estate will always reflect my power and my glory, but I can accomplish that with or without a building on it. In its current form, it reflects my presence, but if you abandon me to worship other gods, this piece of land will stand vacant as a testimony to my absence. Duh. I mean, that's literally why God had them destroy altars and idols throughout the land when the Israelites took the land, was because those gods aren't real. They don't live there. Like, they don't exist there. So naturally, whenever there's an absence, you destroy the altar, the temple, what have you. And so naturally, yes, God is explaining that when he is absent from there, that the temple would be destroyed. Sure. Let's see. All that before he'd even moved in. Think I'm making that up? Read 1 Kings 9. Here's a taste. The temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by it will be appalled and will scoff and say, "Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?" God moved in, but he wasn't committed to staying there under just any conditions. Why? This is important. Okay, yes, it is important. Here are the conditions that he wasn't content to stay under therein. If the children of Israel walked away from Torah and followed other gods, if they fell into idolatry, like it's not going where he's trying to make it go. This is just awful. Because the temple was linked to God's conditional "I will as long as you do" covenant with the nation, the one established on Mount Sinai. But God would see to the demolition of his own home if the people abandon him for other gods. The temple was a nice, The temple was a nice to have, but it wasn't necessary. If we're talking about things that God needs, literally nothing is necessary. The tabernacle wasn't even necessary. If we're talking about things that God wants, that God intends, and that God has commanded, then yes, the temple was in fact necessary. Yeah, he says so the temple wasn't necessary. It wasn't his idea. Yes, it was. That again, that's literally the whole point, is that God took a temporary measure, the tabernacle, to bring the children of Israel through the wilderness into the land where he intended for them to permanently stay, where he could permanently stay on the mountain that he chose. So yes, the temple was always his idea. The temple was more beautiful than it was important. This is just, my gosh. Oh, man. And if Solomon thought the permanent nature of their temple somehow altered the temporary and conditional nature of God's covenant with the nation, he was wrong. Okay. Now, the covenant with Israel was never temporary. Even God says it's not temporary. God literally says it's eternal. Literally says it's eternal. How then are you going to come behind God and say that it's temporary? Conditional, yes, absolutely, it was conditional. That's what the Torah is. The Torah is the conditions. This is really bad. I forgot how bad this is. Let's see. Yeah, and if Solomon thought the permanent nature of their temple somehow altered the temporary and conditional nature of God's covenant with the nation, he was wrong. God made it clear from the founding of the nation that Israel was a divine means to an end. Buddy, my guy, have you read Jeremiah 31? Have you read any of the prophets? Like, this is... Have you read Romans 11? Have you read Ephesians 2? Israel is literally the intention. It's always been the intention. That is the kingdom of God. What Yeshua offers us is that he's the doorway into Israel. That's what he functions as. He doesn't replace Israel. He doesn't supplant Israel. He's the doorway into it for us. I really forgot how bad this was, guys. I am so sorry that you have to hear this. Whew. I just gotta see, like, how much farther we have. Whew. Alright, we're gonna try and blow through this. Because I am, almost 30 minutes into this. Good grief. You may not know this, but Solomon's temple embodied design features similar to pagan temples found throughout the ancient world. All temple architecture is going to have some similarities, but no, the temple was built based on, again, exactly what was shown to Moses. So I mean, what do you mean it had similar? What, it had walls, and other temples had walls too? I mean, this is ridiculous. The level with which he's trying to equate God's temple that God himself established, that God himself honored and filled with pagan temples, this is heresy. Let's see. If you take the Old Testament seriously, it's hard to imagine this to be the case. The Jewish scriptures include extraordinary detail of how the temple was to look, operate, and who had permission to operate it. But despite a few unique features, the Jewish temple shared much in common with pagan temples in the ancient world, including porches, chambers, courts, living quarters, and an altar used for animal sacrifice. Why is he not mentioning that the tabernacle was literally identical? He did he not know that the tabernacle also had an altar? Like, does he not know the tabernacle had an altar? That it also had inner and outer courts? Like, what? He's trying really hard to paint a picture, and he's being so inconsistent about how he paints it. This is really bad. Okay. Pagan temples of that era always included a sacred space designed specifically for the image of the god for whom the temple was built and to whom the temple was dedicated, a god vault. So actually, no. And this is an area of specialty of mine, actually, is pagan and occult religions, particularly of the ancient world. And he's trying to equate the Holy of Holies here to the God vault of pagan temples from back in that time. But they're not equivocal, because the God vault that he's mentioning actually wasn't really a vault. The whole idea was for that God to be on display, front and center, not kept deep within where only few may approach. They were literally, in some cases, even especially, out in the open, like literally out front, where sacrifices could be made to them. So he probably should have done more research on the occult and pagan religion of the ancient world before talking out of his rear, because that's what he's doing here. It was this most sacred of sacred chambers that set the Jewish temple apart from all the competition. In fact, it could be argued that this chamber, often referred to as the Holy of Holies, was the only thing that set the Jewish temple apart from the competition. It definitely set it apart from other pagan temples, for sure, but by no means was the only thing. That's ridiculous. The distinguishing characteristic of the Jewish temple was not something that included the competition. The distinguishing characteristic of the Jewish temple was not something it included that the competition lacked. Quite the opposite. The differentiating characteristic of the Jewish temple was something it lacked that everybody else had. An image. The Holy of Holies was like a beautiful, ornately designed frame without a picture. This is why Israel didn't need a temple to begin with. The distinguishing characteristic of Judaism was not the design of their temple. It was the lack of an image representing their God. Images were strictly forbidden in Judaism. As we discovered earlier, this particular prohibition was one of the Big Ten, which is interesting because, I'm sure that he has a cross somewhere in his church, probably somewhere behind the altar, where people go and kneel and pray. Most churches do. Most churches right there at the back of the building, right behind where the pastor preaches, will have a cross, an image representing their God. The notion of worshipping an image or idol is so foreign to us that an empty idol chamber doesn't strike us as odd, but in ancient times the very opposite was true. A religion without an image was absurd. The Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem in 63 BC. He conducted a self-guided tour of the temple. He was curious to see this Jewish God he'd heard so much about, the one so easily offended, and who considered himself too good to join any pantheon of gods. He brushed aside the priests and boldly went where only the high priest had gone before, the Holy of Holies. He pulled aside the over-engineered curtain separating the God chamber from the outer court, over-engineered. I love how everything that he describes about the temple has to be negative. Like he needs it to be negative. He was dismayed to find that there was no God, no idol, only a golden table and candlestick. Candlestick. He's talking about the menorah. And about 2,000 talents of gold. So this is an interesting thing, actually, is I have seen and heard rabbis teach lessons on how the temple was designed, and like if you could get a bird's eye view at like the floor plan of it, and how everything's situated where it is, almost seems as though it makes a face. So, you know, the spiritual or mystical or what have you, the implication there being that the temple itself exhibits the face of God in a way. And it was a fascinating lesson, actually. I can't remember. I think it was by Rabbi David Foreman. I'll have to fact check that, but I think it was, and if I can find it, I'll mention it in my next video. It really was a fascinating lesson, though. Let's see. All of which he left undisturbed. Perhaps he thought, these crazy Jews, they built this elaborate physical structure for a God who has no physical representation. Who ever heard of a God without an image? Exactly. Who would hear of this strange God who could not be contained within, reduced to, or defined by any created thing? Everybody. How? Through the nation of Israel. Back to Solomon. While the temple may not have been God's original idea, it served a purpose. It's highlighted, accentuated, and underscored the principal difference between Israel's God and those of her neighbors. Israel served a living God, unlike the pagans' gods in Solomon's day, or those worshipped centuries later by citizens of Rome. Israel's God did not need to be carted into his temple and hoisted onto a pedestal. Israel's God never needed to be wheeled out by priests on festival days. Israel's God didn't need to be locked up at night so that no one would steal him or chip off a piece for good luck. Israel's God didn't need bodyguards. He didn't need to be protected from the elements. Israel's God was spirit, a Holy Spirit. Israel's God wasn't put in his temple. Israel's God inhabited his temple. So here he actually is making a few misunderstood assumptions about idolatry. Now, in the ancient world, there surely may have been some cults that believed that the statues they were bowing to were the actual God, and that God, that statue, would act on their behalf. However, that is really not the case for most idolatrous religions. The statues served only as a representation for the God that they understood to be a spiritual being. And this is why you could have, the big statue of this god in the temple, and then the smaller statue of it in your home, and your neighbor also had a statue of it, and you could go almost anywhere and find a statue of this exact same god. And that's because they didn't understand the statue to be the god. They understood the statue to be a representation, all right, or a conduit through which to communicate with that god. It's like, especially in like even the Norse religions, right? Which those are currently on the rise, especially in America and Europe. The Odinist faith is making a massive resurgence. And I'm friends with a few Odinists, and they have statues of Odin in their homes that they do make offerings to. Most recently, I was hanging out with one of my friends who is an Odinist, and he made an offering of mead to this statue. Now, he does not believe that statue is Odin. He understands that statue is a representation of Odin. Okay? Now, naturally, Odin is not a god that I believe exists, because I do not accept that there is any god besides Hashem. But I do understand how that religion and how that faith works. And that is why the offerings and whatnot are made to the statue, is because the statue is the representation and conduit for the spiritual being that they understand to be God. So the assumptions that he's making here, that the people who carted their statues around truly believed that those statues were God, I find it to be a complete misnomer. It doesn't hold a basis in reality, as far as my knowledge of pagan religions go. So this is a lot of him talking out of his rear end. Let's see. Just as he had inhabited the tabernacle all those years ago, he inhabited Solomon's temple on his own terms. Here's how it happened. The priest then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. But the presence of the ark did not equate to the presence of God. The ark containing God's law was not created as an object of worship. What happened next gave the temple its significance. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. The on his own terms presence of the Spirit of God was the distinguishing characteristic of the Jewish temple. Every nation had laws. Every nation had religious rituals and priests. Most ancient religions mandated animal sacrifice. The Jews had all that minus one thing everybody else had. Their temple served as an awe-inspiring frame to draw attention to something that wasn't there. But the purpose behind this magnificent edifice, built to the glory of the invisible God, extended beyond Israel. So a couple of things he said that are half-truths, or not entirely true. Every nation had laws, so he's trying to equate the Torah to the laws of the nations, when even God creates a distinction, okay? God tells the children of Israel that if they obey the Torah, that the nations will look at them and say, what a wise people, right? So God even says of his law, his Torah, that the nations would notice that it's inherently different from what they have. And that is actually because most of the nations surrounding Israel at that time had didactic laws, okay? They were not hard and fast. And if you've even read Hammurabi's Code, sure, there are some similarities that you see with the Torah, and these might even indicate that it was in some way inspired by or based on the Torah. Sure. But it is not inherently so, and it was didactic, which more or less means it wasn't a strict rule of law. It was more a guideline by which to determine behavior. So it was not hard and fast the same way that God's Torah was hard and fast. Now, I know there's a video out there trying to explain how the Torah also was didactic. That video is made by somebody completely ignorant of Jewish teaching and literature, because there's just no evidence in the text or historically that the Torah was in any way didactic. But he also says most religions mandated animal sacrifice. That's true to an extent, but those religions and the animals that they would sacrifice, first of all, it could have been anything, whereas God's temple is much more particular about the animals that you can sacrifice there. They have to be absolutely perfect, and they have to be clean animals, not unclean animals. Whereas for the pagan temples, you can sacrifice anything, be it an unclean animal, and it didn't have to be perfect, not in the slightest. But in addition to that, animal sacrifice did happen, sure. But what most of the religions of the surrounding areas of Israel at the time were known for, the most common sacrifice that they would offer were human sacrifice, very particular child sacrifice. So, yeah, he's in his attempts to try and equate temple practice with pagan practice, he's really telling half-truths here, and not really representing the temple practice in its difference from pagan religions. Notice how vague and general he's being about it, because that's what he has to be in order for you to think that it really wasn't that different. Because once you actually break down into even just a little bit of detail, suddenly the temple practice system is entirely different from the pagan temple practices. Oh, let's see. The Jewish temple, with its intricate sacrificial system, would serve as context. The temple in Jerusalem would serve as ground zero for a series of events that would later reshape the world, not just the ancient world. Not just the ancient world. Unlike pagan gods, Israel's God was not a regional God with a regional scope. Israel's God was the living God whose power and presence was not limited to any particular piece of real estate. The temple would play an important part, but temporary role in God's revelatory plan. Its similarities with other temples in the region punctuated, highlighted, and accentuated and underscored the one significant difference, which set the stage for God's next great activity in the world. Image-free, idol-free was more than a differentiating detail. It pointed to God's global purpose for the nation. This next section, which is the last section, we are a page and a half away from being done here, is called Temples of Doom. When Solomon was anointed king, there was a piece of land. Some refer to this season of Israel, some refer to this season as Israel's golden age. At last it looked as if there was an opportunity for Israel to be a blessing to other nations. But God wasn't ready. Turns out Israel wasn't either. Solomon got a bit distracted by women, foreign women and their foreign gods. The temple talk didn't stick. Okay. So during Solomon's reign, the entire world did benefit from that. So he's wrong there. He is right about one thing that he mentioned, and that's that the other nations' gods were in fact regional. But they could be regional because they were essentially the same across, like from one nation to another. Um, this is why you get like Asherah, Astarte, um, Ishtar, which would actually be pronounced Easter in the original language. Those are different goddesses from different regions, but they're all essentially the same goddess. They fill the same slot in the pantheon. So, yeah, gods could be regional because basically it was the same god. You were just calling them a different name because you were in a different region that spoke a different language. The deity themselves were effectively the same. But yes, the Grecian gods did not have power outside of Greece as far as the ancient world was concerned. The Babylonian gods did not have power outside of Babylon. If you wanted to be protected by your god, you probably needed to stay within the region that they held sway. That is how the ancient world believed, and that's like the one thing that he has gotten 100% accurate this entire time. Let's see. Here's something often overlooked. Along with building his god a temple, Solomon built a host of gods their own miniature temples. Why? To keep his foreign wives happy. How many miniature temples, you ask? Ready for this? About 700. So the idea here being that all 700 of his wives came from a different region where they had different gods, and so he had to build a temple for each one, and so that's 700. It's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. Sure, he probably had multiple wives from different regions. Okay, so he may have had 150 from one particular region, in which case you would have one temple for their gods. And you get where I'm going. This is ridiculous. The author of 1 Kings tells us Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth. He built altars, shrines, and houses of worship for each god worshipped by his, let's say it together, 700 wives of royal birth. So royal birth, royal or noble birth. Israel had nobles. Israel had several nobles. Matter of fact, Daniel, the prophet Daniel, was a child of one such family, a noble family. So it's really the world back then didn't function too differently from like medieval England that we see, where royalty had to marry a noble. It didn't have to be a royal, but a noble would suffice. Again, if you're trying to say 700 wives of royal birth, I mean, you're talking about 700 different kings all over the world. That mathematically does not add up with what we know the world was like back then and the nations and kingdoms that existed. It just mathematically doesn't add up. But if you break it down into nobles of different regions, sure, then it adds up. So he had multiple Israeli wives, multiple Babylonian wives, multiple Egyptian wives, what have you. He had multiple wives from a handful of regions. So a handful of altars built for a handful of gods. Or idols, not gods. Let's see. One of these wives was, can you believe it? Pharaoh's daughter. Even worse, we learn that toward the end of his life, Solomon was worshiping these foreign gods right along with his wives. Not to the exclusion of the God of his father David. It was worse than that. He worshipped them along with the God of his father David. While this is confusing to us, it made all the sense in the world to Solomon. Once Solomon moved God, so to speak, into his very own temple, he reduced God to the level of all of the other pagan deities of all the nations of the earth. No, again, the same conditions would apply to the tabernacle. This is absolutely ridiculous. God had a location similar to the locations of Israel's neighbors that they created for their gods. With the construction of the temple, Israel's mobile God looked a bit more domesticated. Regional. Gone was the tent, the visual reminder that that Israel's God was a traveling God. If he's relegated to a tent, then his mobility is irrelevant. If we're going to be consistent with the way he's presenting the temple, the mobility of the temporary temple, right? The stand-in temple, the mobility of the tabernacle is utterly irrelevant. Let's see. Yeah, gone was God's tent, the visual reminder that Israel's God was a traveling God. Gone was the reminder that he could pick up and go without notice. And with peace in the land, gone was the need to call upon God to protect Israel from her enemies. Under Solomon, Israel was in no position to bless the nations of the earth. Again, factually untrue. By the end of Solomon's reign, Israel looked a lot like all the other nations of the earth. But whereas Solomon forgot or just straight up abandoned his promise to God, God did not forget nor abandon his promise to Solomon. His agreement with Solomon mirrored the conditional nature of his agreement with the nation. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, "Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?" True to his word, in 587 BC, after a bloody siege, Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers poured through a breach in Jerusalem's walls, murdered thousands of citizens, enslaved thousands more, and tore Solomon's temple down to its foundation. Fortunately, God wasn't home that afternoon. He'd moved out long before. So it's interesting because he's trying to base this all around God's warning to Solomon, right? Then why didn't he tear down the temple then? Why did it take him however many hundreds of years to get around to doing that, right? Because Israel went through several kings by the time this actually happened. So yeah, that's the end of this chapter. We're done. But yeah, that was a bad one, guys. I am so sorry that you had to endure that. I suppose you guys may need some of this too, after all that. And we came out to almost exactly an hour. So I am going to end it here, and we'll pick up with Chapter 4 next time. And I'm sure it will be equally excruciating. So have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is where you are. And shalom.